Hello and welcome. Please lower the volume to a gentle level, close your eyes, and let yourself rest in silence. We are about to drift together into sleep, carried by a story told slowly, with no rush. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through history, please give this video a like and subscribe, so you can join us again tomorrow night. Now let us begin with the first story in the Sleepy History series, the quiet bureaucrats of the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty, which stretched from the early 7th century to the early 10th century, is often remembered for its poetry, art, trade routes, and cultural flourishing. But beneath the grand tales of emperors and generals, there existed a quieter world, one that did not make it into most history books or dramatic retellings. The world of the bureaucrats who filled the offices, copied the scrolls, stamped the petitions, and ensured that the machine of government moved at a steady and predictable pace. Imagine long corridors lined with wooden beams and faint lantern light, the smell of ink and parchment always present, the slow scratching of brushes on paper forming a constant background noise. Each morning, clerks and minor officials would arrive before dawn, their robes neatly arranged, their expressions composed, not because they were eager for glory, but because the empire required punctuality and order. They would sit at wooden desks, often worn from years of use, and begin sorting documents, copying decrees from the central administration, or recording the daily flow of taxes and census data. The work was repetitive, yet it gave a sense of structure to the vast Tang realm, stretching from bustling capitals like Chang'an to remote provinces where reports might take weeks to arrive by courier. These bureaucrats were not celebrated heroes, but they were the glue that held everything together. Their lives revolved around procedure. A petition from a farmer might be received, logged, read, copied, sealed, and filed in layers before it ever reached someone with decision-making power. Each step mattered, and each step was carefully outlined by precedent. It was this predictability that allowed the Tang Dynasty to endure and expand its cultural influence. Because when an empire is vast, even the smallest failure in record-keeping or tax collection can ripple outward into disorder. Yet the men who performed these duties were often anonymous. Many had passed the imperial examinations, which meant years of memorizing Confucian classics, writing essays in precise styles, and demonstrating a calm and orderly mind. Those who succeeded found themselves not in positions of adventure, but in roles that demanded patience. They might sit for hours cross-checking grain records from distant provinces, comparing numbers, noting discrepancies, and then drafting cautious recommendations. At the end of the day, the bundles of documents were tied with string, stacked in orderly piles, and placed in archives that smelled of wood and dust. It is easy to imagine the silence of these offices, broken only by the clearing of a throat, the soft rustle of robes as someone shifted in their seat, or the faint creak of wooden floors under the slow steps of a supervising official. The rhythm of bureaucratic life did not change with seasons, for paperwork flowed in summer as it did in winter, and even during festivals, someone was required to remain at the office to ensure that nothing was lost. This constancy created a strange sense of timelessness. One could enter the office as a young man, full of ambition, and after decades find that little had altered except the fading of ink on old scrolls and the deepening of lines on one's face. Some found comfort in this steady routine, for in a world where wars could erupt at distant borders and emperors could rise and fall, the bureaucratic desk was a place of permanence. Others found it wearying, yet still they performed their roles, because stepping outside the system was not considered honorable. What they left behind was not poetry or monuments, but stacks of neatly written records that, centuries later, historians can still examine to reconstruct how life was organized in the Tang Dynasty. To picture it more clearly, one might think of a hall where hundreds of low desks were arranged in rows, each occupied by a man bent over parchment, his brush moving slowly, line after line, character after character, with little variation from the man beside him. The daylight would fade, oil lamps would be lit, and the routine continued until the bell announced the closing of the day. Even then, the work was not truly finished, because tomorrow the cycle would repeat. This endless rhythm of record-keeping, of quiet diligence, of unnoticed labor, was the pulse that kept the Tang administration alive, and though their names are mostly forgotten, the bureaucrats themselves shaped the stability of an empire simply by showing up each day, adjusting their robes, dipping their brushes in ink, and copying the next line without hurry, without pause, in a manner that was as uneventful as it was enduring. The system that produced these quiet officials of the Tang dynasty was as intricate and deliberate as the paperwork they later managed. For entry into the bureaucracy was not a matter of birth alone, though noble families often had advantages. But increasingly it was shaped by the imperial examination system, a process that demanded years, sometimes decades, of memorization, recitation, and copying, not unlike the work that would follow. Young men from across the empire would sit in small rooms, their brushes poised, their minds filled with the words of Confucius, Mencius, and other classical thinkers, and they would write essays judged not on originality of thought, but on precision of style, correctness of references, and steadiness of character. The examination halls could be vast, filled with rows upon rows of desks, yet the silence inside was heavy, broken only by the scratch of brushes and the occasional sigh of a scholar searching his memory for the exact phrasing of a line. For many, failure was common, and men returned year after year to sit again, hoping that this time their preparation and their calmness would carry them through. Success meant entry into the world of officials, but the journey did not end with appointment. For new bureaucrats were often assigned minor posts in distant provinces, where they copied tax records, supervised small storehouses, and sent routine reports back to the capital. Advancement was slow, requiring years of demonstrating diligence without complaint. And even then, promotion often came not from dramatic achievements, but from the quiet accumulation of experience and the absence of mistakes. A careless error in a report could bring censure, while the simple act of producing reliable documents year after year could eventually earn respect. The pace of this career was glacial. A man might spend 20 years before being entrusted with a position of real authority, and by then his life had already settled into predictable patterns. His days defined by the opening of scrolls, the drafting of replies, and the comparison of figures from one province to another. The bureaucracy itself was layered, with clerks supporting junior officials supporting senior ones, and each level checking the work of the one below so that the system functioned like a vast, deliberate chain where each link was small but necessary. This layering was intended to prevent corruption, though it often resulted in delays, for a simple request might take months to climb the ladder of approvals. Still, the structure ensured that the empire's records remained consistent, and in a realm as large as Tang China, consistency was more valuable than speed. In the capital of Chang'an, the great departments were housed in impressive buildings with carved pillars and painted beams. Yet inside them, the work was not dramatic, but repetitive. The Department of Revenue kept records of land and harvests. The Department of Rights oversaw ceremonies and maintained registries of officials. The Department of Justice examined cases and issued rulings in measured tones, and all of them depended on countless minor officials whose names would never be remembered. Each day, sealed packets of documents arrived from distant provinces, carried by couriers who traveled for weeks across mountains and rivers, and these packets were logged, opened, read, and then copied. The originals stored in archives, and the copies sent onward. The flow of information was constant, and the officials became accustomed to the rhythm of its arrival like the tide of an ocean that never stopped. Life within this system demanded patience not only from the officials, but from their families, for the routines of bureaucratic duty often left little room for spontaneity. A clerk might spend his entire day copying characters until his wrist ached, then walk home through the orderly streets of Chang'an, eat a simple meal, and rest so that he could rise before dawn and do the same again. The sense of progress was faint, yet it was present, for each accurate line written, each error avoided, and each record neatly filed contributed to the stability of the dynasty. This was a life of service measured not in glory, but in regularity, and it was this very regularity that allowed the empire to sustain itself for centuries. When modern readers imagine the Tang dynasty, they may think first of poets or warriors, but the bureaucrats formed the invisible foundation beneath them. A network of men whose steady labor ensured that armies could be supplied, taxes collected, and ceremonies performed at the proper time. Their world was one of ink and routine, of rules and registers, and though it seems monotonous, it was this monotony that kept chaos at bay. In the quiet offices of the Tang state, history was not made in sudden bursts, but in the slow accumulation of records. each line written in careful strokes, each file tied and placed on a shelf, forming a structure of order that outlasted the individuals themselves. Outside the offices of the Tang bureaucracy, the daily lives of these quiet officials unfolded in a rhythm as measured as their work. For while the empire thrived on poetry, trade, and grand ceremonies, the bureaucrats themselves often lived in modest homes near the government quarters, rising before dawn and retiring after dusk with little variation from one day to the next. A typical morning began with the sound of roosters or the faint toll of a temple bell in the distance, followed by the slow dressing in official robes, carefully arranged to reflect rank and status, for even the folds of cloth were prescribed by regulations. Breakfast was usually simple, perhaps a bowl of millet porridge, a few pickled vegetables, and hot tea, nothing extravagant, since officials were expected to embody restraint and dignity rather than indulgence. They would then step out into the orderly streets of Chang'an or Luoyang, depending on where they served, joining streams of other officials walking toward the government offices, their movements quiet and deliberate. Along the way, they might pass bustling markets, but unlike merchants or entertainers, the officials moved with calm composure, avoiding unnecessary distraction, for their duty was not to revel in the city's energy, but to carry its administration. Once their tasks in the office ended, usually after hours of copying documents or listening to reports, they returned home to modest courtyards, where evenings were spent with family, reading or reciting classical texts to children in preparation for the examinations that might one day allow them to follow the same path. Family life, too, was structured around order, with respect for elders emphasized, proper rituals maintained, and conversations often revolving around duty, honor, and the importance of maintaining one's reputation. Entertainment existed but was subdued, perhaps listening to the strings of a qin played softly in the evening, or walking through gardens where bamboo rustled in the wind. Yet even in leisure there was a sense of moderation, as if every aspect of life was part of the same larger order. For many officials, friendships developed not through dramatic adventures, but through years of working side by side, sharing tea during short breaks, discussing the precise interpretation of a regulation, or debating passages from the classics. These relationships were steady rather than fiery, bonds formed through shared patience rather than sudden excitement. Even when gatherings occurred, such as banquets hosted on festivals, the tone remained measured, with officials exchanging poetry or polite conversation rather than boisterous revelry. The ideals of Confucian ethics shaped not only their official duties, but their private conduct, urging them to embody filial piety, loyalty, and restraint, so that the boundary between public life and personal life was faint, almost invisible. A man who kept careful records at the office was expected to maintain careful harmony at home, ensuring that his household reflected the same balance as the empire he served. Yet beneath this order there could also be a quiet weariness, for long hours bent over parchment left hands sore and eyes strained, and years of repeating the same motions sometimes led to a sense of monotony that weighed on the spirit. Still, few abandoned their posts, for duty was seen as greater than personal desire, and to resign without proper reason risked dishonor not only for the individual but for the family line. Thus, most endured, day after day, year after year, their lives unfolding with the same deliberate pace as the records they copied. Over time, entire generations grew up in households where children knew their fathers as men of ink and scrolls, men who left each morning with calm expressions and returned each night with weary but composed faces, carrying the invisible weight of an empire's order on their shoulders. And so the bureaucrats of the Tang dynasty lived not in dramatic stories of conquest, but in the quieter story of continuity, a story where each day mirrored the one before, and each life became part of a chain that, while mostly unnoticed, kept the machinery of a vast civilization turning without pause. Among the more formal aspects of the Tang bureaucracy were the rituals and ceremonies that framed the relationship between officials and the emperor, for the dynasty was not only an administrative machine, but also a carefully choreographed stage, where order was displayed through ritual, and even the smallest detail of protocol reinforced the idea that harmony depended on respect for hierarchy. When an official prepared to present a memorial, the document itself was not hastily written, but carefully composed, its language balanced, its calligraphy precise, its tone deferential. The official would spend hours ensuring that every character was properly formed, and then the scroll would be rolled, tied with silk cord, and carried with both hands as he entered the palace. Inside the vast halls of Chang'an, where high ceilings were supported by massive wooden pillars painted in deep reds and greens, the official would bow low, sometimes kneeling, sometimes prostrating himself, before offering the memorial to be read aloud or passed along to imperial attendants. The emperor might respond directly, though more often he would allow ministers of higher rank to discuss and interpret the petition, after which decisions filtered back down the bureaucratic chain in the form of decrees that were copied, sealed, and distributed throughout the empire. These presentations were not dramatic debates, but measured performances, where silence was often as meaningful as words, and where every gesture communicated loyalty and discipline. Even in local government, rituals played a central role. When a provincial magistrate received reports from subordinates, he too followed formalities, sitting at the head of a hall, listening in silence as clerks recited figures or read testimonies, and only afterward making calm notes in the margins before issuing decisions. The rhythm of these gatherings was slow and deliberate, ensuring that the process itself conveyed authority. This emphasis on ritual extended to annual ceremonies, in which officials offered thanks to heaven and earth, to ancestors, and to the emperor himself, reinforcing the idea that their service was not merely administrative but moral, part of a cosmic balance that linked individual duty with the stability of the realm. During festivals, officials were expected to participate in processions, their robes arranged according to strict codes, their steps timed to drums or bells, each action a reminder that the role was less about individuality and more about embodying the continuity of the dynasty. In practice, these rituals could feel repetitive, and for many minor bureaucrats, they were occasions of nervousness rather than grandeur. For a misplaced bow or an incorrectly phrased memorial could draw reprimand. Yet the persistence of these rituals gave the bureaucracy a sense of permanence, as if the very act of repeating them across generations stitched the empire together. The ceremonies also served as points of contact between the imperial center and the countless layers of officials who otherwise labored in obscurity, reminding them that their small tasks were part of something larger, something that stretched back to the ancestors and forward to the future. Within the archives, where thousands of memorials and responses were stored in bundles, the results of these rituals remained, a written echo of voices long gone, preserved in ink long after the men who bowed and wrote had faded into obscurity. To imagine such a moment is to see a hall filled with quiet figures, each standing or kneeling in ordered rows, each waiting his turn, each carrying a scroll that represented hours of careful writing, while attendants moved slowly, collecting documents, bowing in return, and placing them into lacquered boxes to be delivered to the higher offices. There was no rush, no raised voices, no applause, only the steady unfolding of procedure, day after day, year after year, as if the empire itself drew strength from the calm repetition of these actions. For the bureaucrats, participation in these rituals was both duty and reassurance, for it reminded them that their monotonous labors connected to the emperor's vision, even if they never exchanged a direct word with him. In this way, the rituals of the Tang bureaucracy transformed paperwork into ceremony and routine into symbolism, weaving a tapestry of order that was both practical and profound. A tapestry that allowed the Tang dynasty to project stability not only through armies and walls, but through the quiet gestures of men bent in respect, carrying scrolls tied with silk, speaking softly in halls where time seemed to flow as slowly and steadily as the ink on their brushes. One of the least celebrated yet most essential aspects of the Tang bureaucracy was the system of archives, the vast collections of documents that grew year after year, filling storerooms with bundles of parchment and scrolls, each carefully labeled, tied with cord, and placed upon wooden shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Within these archives, the life of the empire was quietly recorded, not in grand narratives but in the unbroken stream of records, petitions, tax reports, judicial cases, and imperial decrees that accumulated with the regularity of the seasons. Entering such a space was not dramatic, but overwhelming in its stillness, for the smell of aged paper and ink hung in the air, the light dim and filtered, the silence broken only by the occasional shuffle of an archivist moving slowly among the stacks. The archivists themselves were officials of lower rank, men whose duty was to ensure that every document found its proper place and could be retrieved when needed. And this task demanded a patience equal to that of the clerks who had written the documents in the first place. A petition filed in a distant province might travel for weeks, be copied in triplicate, and finally end its journey in the shelves of the Central Archive, where it would remain, perhaps untouched, for decades. Yet its presence was vital, for if ever a dispute arose, or a precedent needed to be consulted, the archived document provided the authority of written record. The system was so thorough that it resembled the memory of the empire itself, a memory that did not forget because it was inscribed in thousands upon thousands of lines of text. The process of filing was as structured as every other part of the bureaucracy. Documents arrived in sealed packets, were logged by clerks and registers, then opened and sorted according to subject, region, and date. Each bundle was wrapped tightly, labeled with brushstrokes of neat calligraphy, and tied before being placed on shelves. Over time, these shelves filled, new rooms were built, and still the accumulation continued, year after year, decade after decade, until the archives themselves became like silent cities of paper. For the officials who worked there, life passed in the same slow rhythm as in the offices outside, the difference being that their days were spent not writing new documents but caring for the old, ensuring that scrolls were protected from moisture, insects, or fire, and that no record was ever lost. To many this task seemed dull, but to the Tang state it was invaluable, for it allowed the government to function with continuity across generations. An emperor might die, ministers might be replaced, wars might alter borders, but the archives preserved the knowledge of what had been promised, decreed, or taxed, ensuring that new rulers could claim legitimacy by linking themselves to the decisions of their predecessors. The archivists rarely saw their names remembered, but their invisible labor gave the dynasty its endurance. Imagine rows of shelves stretching into shadow, each holding bundles stacked neatly, some newly written, the ink still dark and sharp, others yellowed with age, the characters faint but still legible. The air would be still, heavy with the scent of dust and ink, while the archivist moved carefully, brush in hand, recording the placement of each bundle in registers that themselves became part of the archive. Once a month, inspections were carried out, supervisors walking slowly down aisles, checking that labels were intact, that no scroll had been misplaced, that the empire's memory remained whole. Even this was ritualized, with reports written about the condition of records, signed, sealed, and themselves filed for future reference. In this way, the archive was both static and alive, unchanging in its purpose, yet constantly growing, a river of documents frozen into shelves, carrying with it the story of an empire told not through heroes or poets, but through clerks and archivists who made sure that nothing was forgotten. It was a world of repetition, of quiet care, of work that few outside ever noticed, and yet without it, the Tang dynasty would have lost the thread of its own continuity. To fall asleep imagining such a place is to picture long corridors of paper and silence, an endless library where time itself is measured not by hours, but by the slow addition of bundles, each one tied, labeled, and placed on a shelf, where it will rest quietly for centuries. Despite the appearance of order and the calm rhythm of daily routines, the bureaucrats of the Tang dynasty were not immune to challenges, for the machinery of administration, though vast and carefully structured, often encountered disruptions caused by human error, natural disaster, or the slow movement of information across such a large empire. When floods struck the Yellow River, when droughts withered the harvest, or when locusts devoured fields in distant provinces, reports would eventually arrive at the capital describing shortages of grain, unrest among farmers, or losses in tax revenue. These reports were copied, filed, and passed through layers of officials before recommendations were drafted. But even the smallest delay could mean weeks or months before a decision was made, by which time conditions on the ground might have changed entirely. In such moments, local officials were expected to act with caution, neither overstepping their authority nor failing to respond. And their actions were later scrutinized in detail by supervisors who compared reports with results. Mistakes were inevitable. A figure copied incorrectly, a seal misplaced, or a courier delayed by weather could distort the flow of information. and the system responded not with swift punishment, but with slow inquiry, layers of memoranda written to explain, clarify, or correct. The process could feel endless, like a stone dropped into water creating ripples that spread outward, each ripple representing another report, another correction, another copy made for the record. Natural disasters were especially challenging because they not only disrupted the harvest, but also disrupted the bureaucratic rhythm itself. Offices in flooded towns were damaged, scrolls soaked or destroyed, archives threatened by dampness, and clerks forced to salvage what they could, drying documents under the sun, recopying those too ruined to keep, and sending urgent appeals for relief supplies. In such cases, the bureaucracy revealed its paradoxical nature, slow in its central decision-making, yet meticulous in preserving the record of what had gone wrong. Entire bundles of reports on disasters still survive today, filled with numbers of households displaced, measures of grain distributed, and estimates of losses, all written in the same calm script, despite the suffering they described. To the officials, the act of recording itself was a duty, a way of imposing order on chaos, even when the reality outside the office walls was far less orderly. Political challenges also tested the system. Factional disputes among higher ministers could delay responses, with documents sometimes passed back and forth between rival offices, each adding annotations or raising objections. For the lower bureaucrats, these disputes mattered little, for their work remained the same: copy the documents, tie the bundles, ensure that the characters were clear and the margins neat. Yet they, too, felt the weight of uncertainty when decisions were delayed, for until a decree was finalized, reports continued to accumulate, creating stacks upon stacks waiting for resolution. Some clerks joked quietly, in the privacy of their homes, that they copied the same problems so many times it seemed to have become permanent. Yet they continued, for their task was not to solve, but to record. In this way, the challenges of the Tang bureaucracy were absorbed into its routine, not erased, but carefully preserved in ink. What emerges is a picture of resilience, not through speed or flexibility, but through the patient acceptance of imperfection and understanding that errors and disasters would occur, but that the record of them must always be kept. Thus, even failure was documented with the same calm precision as success, and the empire endured not because it prevented disruption, but because it transformed disruption into memory. Written down line by line, stored in shelves that grew heavier each year, until the history of difficulties became as much a part of the archive as the history of triumphs. Beyond the capital and the great halls of government, much of the daily work of Tang officials took place in the provinces, where bureaucrats interacted quietly with the lives of farmers, artisans, and townspeople. Their presence felt not through dramatic decrees, but through the regular processes of taxation, record-keeping, and local administration that bound communities into the structure of the empire. A local magistrate, usually appointed after years of service in minor posts, would arrive in a county seat and take up residence in a modest office with a few courtyards, wooden desks, and rooms for clerks. And there he would oversee the collection of taxes, the registration of households, and the resolution of small disputes. Taxes were often paid not in coin, but in grain, silk, or labor, and each payment was carefully recorded, with clerks noting the name of the household, the amount contributed, and the date, all written in neat brushstrokes that would later be copied and sent to the capital. The process was slow but orderly, requiring patience from both the officials and the people, who sometimes waited in long lines outside the county office, their goods carried in baskets, their names recited aloud as clerks wrote them into registers. For the farmers, this was a necessary duty, for only by fulfilling tax obligations could they maintain their land rights and avoid penalties. For the officials, it was an exercise in routine, one that repeated with each season as harvests were measured and recorded. In times of good harvest, the process moved smoothly, with grain piled in storehouses, weighed carefully, and distributed partly to the government and partly kept for local relief. In times of poor harvest, tensions rose, yet even then the bureaucrats approached the matter with calm procedure, writing memorials requesting remissions or aid, and continuing to record figures with the same careful brushwork. Beyond taxes, officials also maintained household registers, detailed lists that recorded the names, ages, and occupations of residents, serving as both census and a means of ensuring that military service and corvée labor could be fairly assigned. These registers were updated annually, clerks walking through villages, asking questions, counting children, and noting changes. It was a quiet intrusion into daily life, one accepted by most as part of belonging to the empire. In disputes, too, the bureaucrats acted less as dramatic judges than as calm mediators, listening to both sides, consulting written codes, and issuing decisions that were then copied into records. A quarrel over a boundary between fields, a disagreement about debts, or a complaint about a neighbor's behavior, all of these passed through the county office, where officials wrote long accounts, sealed them, and filed them away for reference. The people may not have remembered the names of the clerks who wrote these records, but their lives were quietly shaped by the order the system imposed. On festival days, the presence of officials was less visible, for communities gathered to celebrate with music, food, and rituals, while bureaucrats observed respectfully, ensuring that no disturbances occurred. Yet even these moments of joy were noted, for reports about festivals, ceremonies, and local customs were occasionally sent to the capital, creating an archive of daily life, as seen through bureaucratic eyes. In this way, the relationship between officials and people was not one of intimacy, but of structure, steady and predictable, with each side understanding its role. The people provided labor and taxes, the officials provided order and records, and the empire endured through this quiet exchange. To imagine such a scene is to picture a county office on a mild autumn morning, clerks sitting at low desks, their brushes moving across parchment as farmers wait patiently in the courtyard, baskets of grain beside them, the air filled not with excitement but with the steady sound of names recited, weights measured, and seals pressed into wax. It was not dramatic, yet it was this very ordinariness that gave the Tang dynasty its strength. A strength built not in battles, but in the patient routines of countless small interactions, all written down and preserved in ink. Life for the Tang bureaucrats was not entirely confined to ledgers and scrolls, for outside the rigid framework of offices and tax registers, they carried with them habits shaped by the cultural values of their time, habits that emphasized learning, refinement, and the steady cultivation of character. Many officials, even those in lower positions, maintained a personal practice of reading the classics in the evenings, reciting lines from Confucius or Mencius in soft voices, not to impress others but to keep their minds aligned with the ideals expected of servants of the state. Calligraphy, too, played a central role in their lives, for in an empire where the written word was the backbone of governance, the ability to form characters with balance and grace was considered both a skill and a reflection of inner discipline. After long hours copying official documents, some officials would return home and practice calligraphy on clean sheets, writing poems or philosophical passages slowly and deliberately, the brush gliding over paper in strokes that mirrored the calm rhythm of their daily work. Poetry itself was a cherished pursuit, and though not every bureaucrat was destined to be remembered as a great poet, many composed verses in their private time, describing the quiet landscapes of the provinces where they served, the turning of seasons, or the sense of solitude that came with a life of duty. These poems were often shared among colleagues during modest gatherings, where instead of boisterous conversation, the evening would pass with cups of tea or wine, verses recited in low voices, and the slow strumming of a kin in the background. The social life of officials was restrained but not joyless, marked by courtesy, measured words, and mutual respect. Friendships developed over shared lines of poetry, over discussions about the proper meaning of a classical phrase, or over the exchange of carefully written letters. Even leisure carried a sense of formality, for to cultivate one's character was seen as an extension of service to the state. Gardens became spaces of quiet retreat, where officials walked slowly among bamboo groves or sat by ponds watching the ripples of water, finding in nature a reflection of order and permanence. Families, too, were part of this cultural rhythm, with fathers teaching sons to read and write, mothers reminding children of rituals and propriety, and evenings spent listening to elders recount stories of ancestors who had served before. Education was not only preparation for examinations, but also a form of moral training, and households echoed with the sound of brushes scratching on paper as children practiced the same characters their fathers copied in government halls. Festivals offered moments of modest enjoyment when lanterns lit up the streets, when music drifted from pavilions, and when officials might walk with their families among the crowds, still maintaining dignity, yet sharing in the collective joy. In such moments, poetry and calligraphy became public, with verses written on fans, lanterns decorated with characters, and lines recited under the night sky. Yet even here, restraint prevailed, for indulgence was frowned upon, and moderation was always praised. This balance between duty and culture gave the lives of bureaucrats a steady texture, one where personal refinement mirrored professional order, and where leisure, though simple, reinforced the same values that guided their work. To imagine such a life is to picture a man sitting at a desk by lamplight, brush in hand, writing not a tax record, but a quiet poem about falling leaves, while in the next room his children copy characters under the guidance of their mother, and outside the night air carries the distant sound of a temple bell. It was a world where even relaxation carried the weight of tradition, where the arts were not escapes from duty, but companions to it, and where the quiet cultivation of mind and spirit blended seamlessly with the endless copying of scrolls that defined their service. The career of a Tang bureaucrat was defined less by sudden promotion than by long years of waiting, for the structure of the state favored patience, loyalty, and the careful avoidance of mistakes over ambition or daring, and thus the lives of many officials unfolded in a slow progression that mirrored the steady flow of the empire's paperwork. A young man, newly appointed after passing his examinations, might begin with hope that diligent service would carry him swiftly upward, yet he soon discovered that advancement required not only competence, but also the passage of time, and time moved slowly in the halls of administration. Promotions came one step at a time, sometimes after a decade of steady service without error, sometimes after the recommendation of a superior who had observed years of reliable work. For many, the greatest accomplishment was not a leap in rank, but the simple stability of remaining within the system, avoiding disgrace, and preserving the honor of one's family name. As years passed, officials grew accustomed to the rhythm of waiting, their lives measured in terms of routine rather than change. Each season brought the same tasks, the same reports, the same ceremonies, and as the seasons repeated, so too did the officials age, their hair graying, their hands stiffening from years of brushwork, their eyesight dimming from long hours reading characters by lamplight. Yet they continued, for the bureaucracy did not retire easily, and an official's worth was judged by his endurance as much as by his intellect. To some, the slowness of advancement became a quiet burden, a weight of deferred hopes, yet they bore it with composure, telling themselves that service itself was the reward, and that recognition, if it came at all, would be a gift of patience. There were those who reached old age still in modest posts, their dreams of higher office long set aside, yet they carried out their duties with the same careful attention as in their youth, knowing that stability was more valuable to the empire than brilliance. In this way, the bureaucracy transformed personal ambition into collective endurance, channeling individual lives into the greater order of the state. The emotional life of these officials was subdued, for they were trained to restrain desire, to master disappointment, and to see their service as part of a chain extending beyond themselves. Still, in the quiet of evening, some must have felt the slow passage of years pressing heavily, watching their children grow while their own positions scarcely changed, writing the same characters by lamplight that they had written decades before. Yet this constancy was also a comfort, for in a world where wars might erupt at the borders or emperors might fall from power, the daily tasks of bureaucracy provided a sense of permanence. Advancement, when it came, was often modest: a higher stipend, a larger office, the responsibility of supervising a few more clerks. Rarely did it transform a life, but it did affirm the value of steady labor. And so the bureaucrats aged alongside the system they served, their lives blending into the continuity of the dynasty, leaving behind little more than the ink of their records and the faint memory of their names in dusty registers. To imagine such a life is to see a man who begins his career with bright eyes and dark hair, sitting at a low desk with energy, and decades later the same man with lined face and slower hand, still copying, still filing, still waiting. His hope for promotion quiet now, replaced by a calm acceptance that his duty is to serve until he can no longer lift the brush. In this way, the Tang bureaucracy aged with its men, slowly, patiently, and without fanfare, embodying a rhythm of waiting that stretched across generations. When one reflects on the legacy of the Tang dynasty, it is tempting to focus on the emperors who ruled from grand palaces, the poets whose verses have been recited for centuries, or the merchants who carried silk and porcelain along the great trade routes. Yet beneath these visible figures, there existed another legacy, quieter and less celebrated, belonging to the countless bureaucrats who spent their lives bent over desks, brushes in hand, creating the written foundation upon which the dynasty rested. Their contribution was not measured in battles won or monuments built, but in the steady maintenance of order, the quiet copying of decrees, the careful filing of petitions, and the patient recording of every detail that kept an empire of vast size from dissolving into confusion. It was they who ensured that taxes were collected, that censuses were updated, that laws were remembered, and that precedents were preserved. And though they left behind no statues or epic poems, their ink formed the invisible threads that bound the Tang world together. Their legacy was endurance, the transformation of monotony into stability, the conversion of routine into permanence. Each generation of officials replaced the last, inheriting the same rituals, the same offices, the same piles of scrolls, and continuing without interruption, so that the flow of governance remained unbroken even as individuals aged and passed away. This continuity gave the dynasty resilience, for while emperors changed and political factions rose and fell, the bureaucracy remained, carrying forward the memory of the state. To imagine their legacy is to picture not a single heroic act, but the vast accumulation of small acts. A clerk carefully weighing grain and recording the figure, a magistrate listening patiently to a boundary dispute and writing his decision, an archivist tying a bundle of documents with cord and placing it neatly on a shelf. Each act was unremarkable on its own, but together they formed the enduring rhythm of a civilization. Even in decline, when the Tang faced rebellions, economic strain, and weakening authority, the bureaucratic habit persisted, and documents continued to be written, copied, and filed, as if the empire's memory refused to vanish, even when its power waned. Centuries later, historians sifting through those records find not the voices of emperors alone, but the traces of ordinary officials whose careful brushstrokes preserve the details of daily life, the names of households, the measures of fields, the outcomes of disputes. In this way, the bureaucrats achieved a kind of immortality, not through fame, but through the survival of their work, which still whispers across time in the silent halls of archives. Their story is not one of excitement, but of constancy, and it reminds us that the endurance of a dynasty depends not only on visionaries and warriors, but also on those who patiently keep order, who accept routine, who embrace repetition, and who, through their quiet persistence, allow others to flourish. The Tang dynasty's brilliance in poetry, art, and trade could not have existed without the steady scaffolding built by its bureaucrats. And so their legacy is everywhere, hidden but essential, silent but enduring. To fall asleep thinking of them is to imagine a hall filled with rows of desks, each occupied by a figure in plain robes, each brush moving slowly across parchment, each line adding to the quiet heartbeat of an empire, a heartbeat that lasted for centuries and still echoes faintly in the records that remain. That brings us to the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, may I kindly ask you for a like and a subscribe. Your support helps keep these quiet journeys through history alive. And now, let us continue with the next tale in our Sleepy History series, the tax collectors of ancient Egypt. In the long history of ancient Egypt, stretching across millennia from the Old Kingdom to the Ptolemaic period, much is remembered about the pyramids, the temples, the rituals for the gods, and the names of powerful pharaohs. Yet behind these visible symbols of power and devotion, there existed another world, quieter but essential, a world defined by the collection of taxes and the officials who carried out this task, with the same patience and repetition that would later be found in other bureaucracies across time. The Egyptian state required resources to build monuments, to feed workers, to sustain armies, and to maintain the rituals that ensured cosmic order. And so from the earliest dynasties, officials known as scribes and overseers of fields devoted themselves to the steady management of resources, walking the floodplains of the Nile with reed pens and rolls of papyrus, measuring grain, recording harvests, and noting the contributions of each household. Their work was neither dramatic nor glorious, but it was constant. For every year the Nile flooded, leaving behind fertile soil, and every year the cycle of planting, harvesting, and collecting repeated without fail. The tax collectors were not soldiers or priests, though they occasionally worked alongside them, but rather men trained in writing and arithmetic, skills that gave them authority in a land where literacy was rare. To imagine their lives is to picture a man in simple linen garments, carrying a small wooden pallet, with ink cakes and a reed brush, standing in a field as laborers bring baskets of grain to be weighed. He notes the amount, writes the name of the household, calculates the portion due to the state, and inscribes the figures neatly onto papyrus. Behind him, assistants tie bundles of grain to be transported to storehouses, where they will later be redistributed or stored for times of famine. The process was orderly, but it required endurance, for in large districts hundreds of households had to be recorded, and every entry had to be accurate, since errors could mean shortages or disputes. Over time, the records grew into long lists, preserved in archives where scribes reviewed them and compared them to previous years, checking for discrepancies. The tax collector's duties extended beyond grain, for taxes could also be paid in livestock, in oil, in beer, or in labor, with corvée service requiring men to contribute days of work on public projects, from maintaining canals to hauling stones for temples. Each of these contributions was carefully noted, with officials keeping track of who had fulfilled their obligations and who had not. To the farmers, the tax collectors represented the presence of the state, appearing after harvest to remind them of their duties, their tallies written in symbols that most could not read, but all understood carried weight. The collectors themselves lived modestly, often in small houses near the administrative centers, their daily lives shaped by the rhythm of recording and reporting. At dawn, they might meet in offices with colleagues, compare notes, prepare scrolls, and then disperse into the fields or villages to collect. At dusk, they returned, weary from walking under the hot sun, their papyrus rolls filled with figures, their minds focused not on drama, but on accuracy. In the evening, they copied their notes more carefully, creating official versions for the archives, tying them with cord and delivering them to superiors, who would ensure that the grain flowed to the right storehouses. To modern eyes, this work may seem monotonous, but to the Egyptian state, it was the foundation of its stability. For without the constant labor of tax collectors, there would have been no great pyramids rising at Giza, no temples standing at Luxor, no armies patrolling the deserts. Their contribution was invisible yet vital, a rhythm of collection and record-keeping that stretched across centuries. To fall asleep imagining their world is to picture the slow procession of men with baskets of grain, the steady hand of a scribe writing symbols onto papyrus, the calm movement of officials storing bundles in warehouses by the Nile, and the endless cycle of the river itself, flooding, receding, and leaving behind the soil that fed the people and sustained the state. The figure most closely associated with the collection of taxes in ancient Egypt was the scribe, for in a land where writing was the key to authority and where only a small portion of the population could read and record, the scribe stood at the center of administration, quietly shaping the machinery of the state with his reed pen and palette. To become a scribe required years of training, beginning often in childhood, with boys from families of minor officials or artisans sent to schools attached to temples or government offices, where they learned to copy hieroglyphs and hieratic script, practicing endlessly until their strokes were precise and their memory strong. The daily exercises of a young scribe in training were monotonous. Lines repeated again and again, passages from older texts copied until the hand obeyed without hesitation. In time, these boys grew into young men who could read accounts, calculate figures, and draft official documents, skills that opened doors to positions within the bureaucracy. The scribe's tools were simple but essential: a wooden palette with grooves for black and red ink, brushes made from reeds cut to a point, and rolls of papyrus smoothed and prepared for writing. With these tools, he recorded harvest yields, tax assessments, census data, and decrees, all in characters that seem mysterious to the majority of farmers, who could not read them but understood their significance. When the time came to collect taxes, the scribe accompanied overseers to the fields, writing down the measurements of grain, the numbers of cattle, or the obligations of households, ensuring that everything was recorded in a form that could later be stored in archives and compared to other records. His presence gave weight to the process, for a number written on papyrus carried the authority of the state, more enduring than memory or spoken agreement. Within Egyptian society, scribes occupied a special place, respected for their knowledge yet living modestly, their lives bound more to duty than to luxury. They were not nobles, but they had privileges, exempted from heavy labor and military service, for their minds and hands were considered too valuable to risk. Their days followed a steady rhythm, beginning in offices near temples or granaries, where they organized their scrolls, then moving into the fields or marketplaces to observe and record, and finally returning to copy their notes into cleaner versions, stored with care. Evenings might be spent teaching apprentices or reading older texts, keeping alive the traditions of writing that had endured for centuries. Though their work was not physically demanding, it required concentration, accuracy, and patience, for an error could bring confusion or suspicion, and precision was valued above all. In this way, the scribes became the quiet architects of order, linking the work of farmers and artisans with the needs of the state. To picture their lives is to imagine men bent over papyrus in dimly lit rooms, the sound of reed brushes scratching softly, the faint smell of ink, and the steady repetition of symbols across the page. Outside, the Nile flowed as it always had, flooding fields and feeding the soil, while inside the offices the scribes' hands moved in harmony with that eternal rhythm, transforming the cycles of nature into cycles of record. Their role in society was not celebrated in monuments, but it was respected in daily life, for people knew that without the scribes, the state could not function, and without the state, the protection of fields, canals, and temples would falter. Thus the scribes became part of the invisible foundation of ancient Egypt, their legacy preserved not in statues, but in the countless documents that still survive, testifying to the quiet persistence of men who spent their lives writing, copying, and recording. Each year in ancient Egypt, the cycle of taxation followed the cycle of the Nile, for the river's flood determined the fertility of the fields, and the fertility of the fields determined the amount of grain and goods that households would owe to the state. And so the work of the tax collectors began, with the slow and careful measurement of harvests once the waters had receded and the crops had ripened under the sun. Surveyors walked the boundaries of fields with ropes and measuring rods, accompanied by scribes who recorded the size of each plot, the condition of the soil, and the expected yield. And when the time came for collection, the officials returned to weigh the grain itself. Farmers carried baskets or sacks filled with barley or wheat, placing them before officials who used balances and standard weights to measure with precision. The figures were spoken aloud, noted by scribes, and compared with the obligations assigned to that household in previous years, ensuring that each family contributed its fair portion to the state. Once assessed, the grain was carried to granaries, large mud brick storehouses often built near temples, or along the riverbank, where it was poured into bins or piled in heaps, guarded by overseers who kept careful watch. The granaries were massive structures with high walls and narrow entrances, designed to keep out thieves and pests, and within them, the grain was organized according to district and type, each section labeled by scribes whose writing turned piles of barley and wheat into part of the official record. The process was not hurried, for each step mattered: the weighing, the recording, the sealing, the storage. Farmers might wait for hours in the heat as their grain was inspected, yet the system was accepted as part of life, for it had been repeated for centuries, and everyone knew that the surplus collected would be used to feed laborers on state projects, to support soldiers, or to provide relief in years of poor harvest. Beyond grain, taxes could also be collected in oil, honey, cattle, or linen, each assessed in the same methodical way, with scribes noting the quantity and quality, and overseers ensuring delivery to the appropriate storehouses. Livestock were counted and branded, jars of oil sealed with clay stoppers marked by officials, and bolts of linen measured and folded before being stored. All of this was accompanied by paperwork, rolls of papyrus filled with lists that were then sent up the chain of administration, copied and filed so that every contribution was accounted for. The rhythm of the system created a sense of permanence, linking each household to the state through ink and grain, through numbers and storage. The granaries themselves became symbols of security, standing silent and solid near the Nile, their walls holding the wealth of the land, guarded by men who walked slowly along their perimeters, while inside scribes checked inventories by lamplight. To imagine such a scene is to picture the warm air filled with the scent of grain, the low murmur of voices as figures are read aloud, the steady scratching of reed brushes as names and amounts are inscribed, and the quiet satisfaction of officials who know that order has been maintained for another year. It was not dramatic work, yet it was essential, for without these collections, the great monuments of Egypt would never have been built, the temples never supplied, and the armies never fed. The system endured because it was repetitive, because it was steady, and because each year it turned the unpredictable flood of the Nile into predictable stores of food and resources. Thus, the cycle of measurement, collection, and storage became the heartbeat of the Egyptian state, a heartbeat written in ink, stored in grain, and carried forward by the patient labor of tax collectors and scribes, who ensured that the river's bounty was never wasted, but always transformed into order. Once the grain and goods were collected from the farmers and weighed by the officials, they entered the silent world of the granaries, where the wealth of ancient Egypt was preserved not in glittering treasure, but in endless piles of barley and wheat, resting within walls of mud brick that kept out heat, wind, and thieves. These granaries were monumental in their own way, often built with thick walls and narrow entrances, so that only a few men at a time could pass through, and once inside the air was heavy, with the scent of dried grain, dust rising in shafts of sunlight that filtered through small openings. The work of maintaining these storehouses fell to overseers and keepers, who spent their days monitoring the grain, ensuring that sacks were stacked properly, that bins were sealed, and that records matched the supplies visible before them. The scribes played their part here as well, seated at low wooden tables or standing with reed pens and pallets, writing inventories that listed the contents of each section of the storehouse, noting not only the amount of grain, but also its condition, whether freshly harvested or carried over from previous years. Each delivery was registered, each withdrawal documented, so that the flow of grain could always be traced. Guards patrolled the outer walls slowly, their presence reminding all who passed that the storehouse belonged to the state, and that tampering with its contents was not only a crime, but a sacrilege. For grain collected in taxes was often linked to offerings for the gods, as well as provisions for the people. Inside, laborers moved quietly, carrying sacks from one side to another, patching cracks in walls, or sweeping floors to keep away pests. The days passed without drama, each one filled with the same repetitive actions of storing, recording, and inspecting. During particularly hot months, overseers worried about spoilage, checking for signs of moisture or rot, and when problems were found, teams of workers spread the grain out under the sun to dry before returning it to storage, while scribes dutifully noted the quantities treated and the hours spent. At intervals, inspectors from higher offices visited, walking slowly through the granaries, comparing written lists with the actual piles, ensuring that no discrepancy existed. Their movements were deliberate, their questions quiet, and when satisfied, they signed their names on reports that themselves became part of the archives. To imagine such a day is to see shafts of sunlight catching dust in the still air, rows of baskets stacked neatly, the soft shuffling of feet on packed earth floors, the distant sound of a guard's spear tapping lightly as he paced, and the calm concentration of a scribe bending over papyrus, his brush moving steadily, line after line. The granaries were not only repositories of grain, but symbols of security, for within their walls the Egyptian people knew that the bounty of the Nile had been preserved against famine, that workers on temple projects would be fed, and that the state's obligations could be met. Year after year, as floods rose and receded, the cycle of storing and guarding repeated itself, unchanged in rhythm, creating a sense of timelessness. The keepers of the granaries aged within those walls, watching the same routines pass season after season, their lives measured by inventories rather than events. And though their names were rarely remembered, the quiet permanence of their labor ensured that the civilization endured. To fall asleep imagining this world is to picture the dim interior of a storehouse, the smell of grain, the soft scratching of a reed pen on papyrus, and the steady patience of men who devoted their lives to preserving order, one sack, one list, one season at a time. The grain and goods gathered in the storehouses of ancient Egypt were not meant to remain idle, for they represented the lifeblood of the state, carefully preserved to be distributed where needed. And among the most important uses of these tax collections was the feeding of workers who labored on the great public projects that still define Egypt today, from pyramids and temples to canals and city walls. Contrary to later myths that imagined slaves toiling under the lash, much of the work on these monumental projects was carried out by ordinary Egyptians serving their required labor duty to the state, known as corvée service. And while they gave their time and strength, it was the tax grain that gave them food, ensuring that thousands of men could labor day after day without collapsing from hunger. At dawn, groups of workers assembled near construction sites, where bread and beer made from the taxed grain were distributed, measured in careful rations by overseers, who checked names against lists prepared by scribes. The meals were simple but sustaining: coarse bread baked in clay ovens, beer brewed thick and nutritious, often flavored lightly with dates, all products of the harvest that had been collected months earlier from farmers across the Nile Valley. The workers ate quickly, then turned to their tasks, some hauling stone blocks, others shaping limestone, others carrying water or tools, each role essential to the slow progress of building. As the sun climbed higher, another ration was provided, again drawn from the tax stores, so that labor could continue through the heat of the day. The scribes were present here as well, seated under shade with their palettes and papyrus, recording the names of those who received rations, the amounts distributed, and the hours worked, creating records that would later be stored alongside tax rolls in archives. To walk through such a site would not have been to see chaos, but order, a steady rhythm of men laboring, overseers directing, and scribes recording, all bound together by the grain collected months before. The same system extended to temple building, where artisans carved reliefs, painted walls, or raised columns, their families fed by state rations that tied artistic creation to the bureaucracy of taxes. Even projects of irrigation, such as digging canals or repairing dikes, relied on the system, with laborers compensated not in coin, but in food drawn from the granaries. In this way, the taxes of farmers in distant villages were transformed into bread for workers hundreds of miles away, linking the smallest household to the grandest monument. The people understood this connection, and though the burden of taxation could be heavy, it was accepted as part of the eternal cycle of service to the gods, the pharaoh, and the community. The system endured because it was predictable, repeating year after year, with grain flowing from the fields into granaries, from granaries into ovens, and from ovens into the hands of workers whose labor left stone monuments that still stand thousands of years later. To picture this process is to imagine the smell of fresh bread rising in village ovens, the sound of scribes calling names as they marked lists, the sight of baskets of grain carried to brewing vats, and the slow, steady movement of men at work under the sun, their strength sustained by the invisible hand of tax collectors who had ensured that the food was there. It was not a system of glamour, but it was one of endurance, and it shows how the monotonous labor of recording, collecting, and storing made possible the extraordinary creations of Egyptian civilization. Not every year in ancient Egypt brought abundance, for the Nile, though generous, did not always flood as expected, and when the waters rose too little or too much, harvests suffered, leaving fields dry or drowned, and families faced shortages that threatened hunger across the land. Yet it was in these difficult times that the system of taxation revealed another purpose. For the grain collected in years of plenty was not only meant for monuments and workers, but also for relief in years of scarcity, and the same bureaucrats who once measured contributions now turned to distributing aid with equal patience and attention to detail. When word reached officials that villages faced hunger, overseers and scribes unlocked granary doors, their keys heavy with responsibility, and began the slow process of rationing supplies to the people. Scribes recorded the names of households, the numbers of mouths to feed, and the exact portions given, so that no one could claim more than was fair, and no household would be overlooked. Villagers gathered quietly at granary courtyards, carrying baskets or jars, waiting in long lines under the sun, while officials measured out grain, poured carefully from sacks, and handed it over in amounts determined by household size. The process was orderly rather than hurried, for even in times of distress, the Egyptian state prized calm and structure, believing that fairness required precision. The people accepted their portions with gratitude, understanding that what they received had once been the contributions of their neighbors in better years. stored by the state for just such emergencies. In this way, the taxes of the past returned to sustain the community in the present, creating a sense of trust in the system, even if the burden of taxation sometimes weighed heavily in times of abundance. The records of these distributions still survive on papyrus. Long lists of names and numbers, dry and repetitive to the modern reader, yet each line represented a family saved from hunger, each tally a measure of relief carried out by anonymous hands. To picture such a day is to imagine villagers standing in silence, the air filled with dust and the smell of grain, children clutching their mothers' garments, scribes bent over their scrolls writing names, overseers checking weights on balances, and the quiet murmur of voices as portions were handed out one by one. Guards stood at the doors of the granary, watching carefully, ensuring order, while within the dim walls of storage rooms men shifted sacks, carried baskets, and filled jars. At the end of the day, the officials tied up the papyrus rolls, marked with inked seals, and filed them away so that future inspectors could see exactly what had been distributed. For in Egypt, even generosity was recorded with the same precision as taxation. This system of relief did not erase the hardships of famine, but it lessened their impact, and it reinforced the role of the state as guardian of stability, showing that the taxes taken in good years were not lost, but preserved as security for bad years. For the officials themselves, the work was another extension of their duty, performed with the same calm endurance as their other tasks, and though their names are forgotten, their actions ensured that life along the Nile continued without collapse. To fall asleep thinking of their work is to imagine not panic but patience, not chaos but order, a world where even in hunger the people lined up calmly, where scribes wrote steadily, and where the silent granaries opened their doors to release the hidden wealth of the river, transforming records on papyrus into bread on the table, sustaining families until the Nile's waters returned to their proper rhythm once more. While grain formed the backbone of taxation in ancient Egypt, it was by no means the only form of contribution expected from households, for the state recognized value in many goods produced along the Nile, and so tax collectors, scribes, and overseers also measured and recorded livestock, oil, honey, beer, linen, and other products that sustained both daily life and the needs of the temples and government. The collection of cattle was particularly important, for herds represented wealth and labor, and each year officials traveled into villages and fields to count animals carefully, marking their numbers on papyrus rolls, branding them when necessary, and ensuring that contributions were delivered to state herds or used for temple sacrifices. The process was slow and deliberate, with cattle led one by one before scribes who noted their size, color, and ownership, the reed brush scratching steadily as assistants guided the animals past. Oil and honey, gathered in jars sealed with clay stoppers, were also part of the tax system, and these too were measured carefully, the jars weighed, inspected for quality, and stacked in storerooms where scribes attached labels noting their origin. Beer, brewed thick and nutritious, served as both sustenance and tax payment. Carried in clay vessels balanced on the shoulders of laborers who lined up outside offices to have their contributions recorded. Linen, woven by women in households across Egypt, arrived in folded bolts, measured against rods, and noted by scribes before being stored for use in clothing, sales, or temple rituals. Each of these forms of taxation required its own method of inspection, yet all were unified by the same principle of precision, with scribes ensuring that no entry was vague, no tally left incomplete. For the people, these contributions could feel burdensome, yet they were woven into the rhythm of life, accepted as part of the eternal cycle of duty to the pharaoh and to the gods. The records that survive show long lists of items, dry and repetitive in tone, but behind every line was a household fulfilling its obligations, a family delivering cattle, oil, or linen, and an official writing the symbols that transform those goods into part of the state's economy. To imagine such a day is to picture a courtyard filled with the lowing of cattle, the smell of oil and honey, the sight of jars stacked neatly in rows, the sound of linen bolts being folded and set aside, and always the steady presence of scribes bent over their papyrus, writing names and amounts with patience. Guards watched the process, ensuring order, while overseers checked weights and measures, their movements unhurried, their eyes scanning for accuracy. At the end of each collection day, the goods were transported to granaries, storehouses, or temple precincts, where they would later be redistributed or used. While the records themselves were tied, sealed, and sent upward through the bureaucratic chain, nothing was left to memory alone. Everything was inscribed, archived, and preserved. In this way, taxation in Egypt was not limited to the fields, but touched every aspect of production, linking the work of farmers, herders, brewers, and weavers to the needs of the state. The quiet persistence of these collections, repeated year after year, gave the system its endurance. And though to the individuals it may have felt routine, in the larger view it sustained the civilization for centuries. To fall asleep imagining this world is to hear the soft murmur of voices in a courtyard, the shuffle of cattle hooves on packed earth, the faint scratch of reed pens on papyrus, and to see the endless flow of goods transformed into records. Records transformed into order, and order transformed into stability. The taxes of ancient Egypt did not serve only the needs of administration and public works, but were deeply entwined with religion. For the temples that rose along the Nile, dedicated to gods such as Amun, Ra, Osiris, and Isis, required a constant flow of offerings, supplies, and labor, all of which were sustained through the careful system of collection, overseen by scribes and officials. Temples were not merely places of worship, but vast economic centers, owning land, employing workers, and serving as storehouses of grain, oil, and cloth. And the taxes collected from the population ensured that their rituals could be carried out without interruption, day after day, year after year. Each morning, priests entered sanctuaries to bathe, clothe, and feed the statues of the gods, presenting bread, beer, meat, and incense. And all of these offerings came from the taxes gathered from fields and households across Egypt. The scribes recorded the flow of goods into temple granaries with the same precision they applied to state storehouses, noting the exact amounts of grain or honey delivered, the dates of arrival, and the districts from which they came. Overseers walked through temple kitchens and workshops, observing bakers who transformed grain into bread, brewers who produced beer, and butchers who prepared cattle, all sustained by taxes paid in kind. Linen contributed by families was woven into garments for statues and priests, while oil-lit lamps that burned in sanctuaries, the steady flame a visible sign of the invisible work of countless tax collectors and farmers who had supplied the resources. To picture such a system is to imagine long courtyards where offerings were arranged in orderly rows, priests moving slowly with solemn gestures, scribes writing quietly at the side, and temple granaries echoing with the same sounds as state storehouses. The rustle of grain, the creak of baskets, the steady scratch of reed brushes on papyrus. For the people, paying taxes to support temples was not only a civic duty, but a religious obligation. For in their view, the well-being of the gods ensured the well-being of the land, the regular flooding of the Nile, and the stability of the cosmos. Thus, even if the burden was heavy, it was accepted as part of the eternal exchange between humans and the divine. Temples grew wealthy through these flows of goods, but the wealth was not idle, for it supported entire communities of workers, craftsmen, and priests, all of whom lived from the steady supplies managed by bureaucrats. The connection between taxation and religion reinforced the authority of the pharaoh, who was both ruler and divine intermediary, ensuring that taxes collected in his name flowed upward to sustain the gods themselves. In this way, the monotony of record-keeping acquired a sacred dimension, transforming lists of grain and jars of oil into offerings of devotion, preserved in archives that today still contain traces of the ink that once affirmed Egypt's cosmic balance. The officials themselves may not have thought of their work as holy, yet they knew that without their records, offerings could be disrupted and rituals broken, and so they carried out their tasks with quiet care. To fall asleep imagining this world is to see the temple courtyards filled with bread and beer, to hear the chants of priests blending with the scratching of pens, to smell incense rising above the odor of grain, and to sense the steady, unbroken rhythm of a society where bureaucracy and religion were not separate but bound together, each sustaining the other in a cycle as endless as the Nile's flood. Although the system of taxation in ancient Egypt was built on routine and accepted as part of life, there were always those who tried to avoid their obligations, whether by hiding portions of their harvest, underreporting the number of livestock they owned, or attempting to bribe minor officials to overlook discrepancies. And because the state depended so heavily on the steady flow of resources, the bureaucracy developed careful methods of control, inspection, and punishment to discourage evasion. Scribes compared current records with older lists, checking whether a household's contribution matched expectations from previous years, and overseers walked fields to ensure that declared harvests were not suspiciously low. When discrepancies were found, farmers might be summoned before local officials, questioned patiently yet firmly, and their explanations recorded in long notes that were themselves filed into the archives. If guilt was established, penalties could include additional levies, confiscation of goods, or enforced labor, all recorded with the same calm precision as regular taxes. In more serious cases, where deception was judged deliberate and repeated, punishments could be physical, though even these were administered as part of procedure, rather than impulsive cruelty, with scribes present to note the judgment, the punishment, and its execution, ensuring that nothing occurred without written record. The presence of guards during tax collection also served as a quiet reminder that the system was backed not only by ink, but also by authority. And while violence was not constant, the possibility of enforcement reinforced compliance. For most people, the risks of evasion outweighed the burden of contribution, and so the majority accepted the system, seeing it as part of the balance between community and state, between humans and gods. The bureaucrats themselves were cautious, for they too could face consequences if their records showed negligence or irregularity, and so they double-checked figures, recounted livestock, and reviewed lists with patience, knowing that their careers depended on accuracy. Inspectors traveled between villages and districts, comparing reports from different levels of administration, and their presence kept both farmers and local officials attentive to their duties. To imagine this world is to see a farmer standing before a magistrate, hands clasped nervously, while a scribe writes steadily at a desk, noting each question and answer, or to picture an overseer walking through a field after harvest, bending to examine the stubble, then straightening to mark something quietly on his papyrus roll. It was not a world of open rebellion, but of quiet discipline, where most complied because the system was predictable, the penalties certain, and the weight of tradition strong. Even punishment became another entry in the archives, another line in the long record of Egypt's attempt to maintain order through taxes. And so the cycle continued, not broken by widespread defiance, but sustained by the knowledge that the state would notice, that the scribes would record, and that the balance between duty and consequence was always maintained. To fall asleep thinking of this is to imagine the still air of a small office, the scratch of a reed pen, the quiet voice of an official questioning, the rustle of papyrus as it is rolled and sealed, and the steady presence of authority that watched calmly over every transaction, ensuring that the Nile's bounty flowed as it was meant to, without interruption. When we look back at the civilization of ancient Egypt, with its towering pyramids, sprawling temple complexes, long canals stretching across the floodplain, and the endless lines of hieroglyphs carved into stone, it is easy to think first of pharaohs, priests, or armies. Yet beneath the grandeur of monuments and the names of kings, there existed the quiet, enduring system of taxation that made it all possible. And at the center of that system were the tax collectors, scribes, overseers, and laborers who devoted their lives to measuring harvests, recording contributions, storing grain, and ensuring that resources flowed steadily from the hands of the many into the projects of the state. Their legacy is not one of dramatic stories or sudden events, but of routine repeated year after year, a cycle as steady as the Nile itself, where farmers planted, reaped, and delivered their share, where officials counted, wrote, and stored, and where the surplus became the foundation upon which civilization stood. Without these collections, there would have been no bread to feed workers building temples, no beer to sustain laborers, digging canals, no oil to light lamps in sanctuaries, no linen for priests or sails for boats, and no reserves to feed the people in times of famine. The tax system turned the unpredictable rhythm of nature into predictable order, transforming floods into figures, fields into lists, grain into rations, and human effort into enduring stone monuments. It was not glamorous work, for the men who bent over papyrus rolls in dimly lit offices, or who weighed baskets of barley in dusty courtyards, left behind no great fame, Yet their anonymous hands ensured that the machinery of the state moved without collapse for centuries. Their contribution was monotony, transformed into stability, repetition elevated into permanence, and in that sense their legacy endures as strongly as that of kings. To imagine their world is to see rows of scribes at their low desks, their reed pens scratching steadily, overseers walking slowly through fields with measuring cords, granaries filled with the smell of grain, villagers lined up in patient silence, and papyrus rolls tied with cords and stacked neatly in archives that served as the memory of the state. It is to sense the rhythm of lives spent not in pursuit of glory, but in the steady fulfillment of duty, each small act of recording or weighing adding to a larger structure that outlasted generations. Even when dynasties rose and fell, the bureaucracy of taxation persisted, adapting to new rulers but never abandoning its essential role. And in this continuity lay the secret of Egypt's longevity. The monuments that still stand on the banks of the Nile are visible testaments to greatness, but the invisible testament is the system that fed workers, supplied temples, and balanced the needs of the many with the projects of the few. That invisible testament belongs to the tax collectors of ancient Egypt, whose endless repetition of tasks created the conditions for civilization itself. To fall asleep with this thought is to imagine a timeless cycle: the Nile flooding, the farmers planting, the officials collecting, the scribes recording, the granaries filling, and the people sustained. A cycle that turned nature's gift into human order, and human order into one of the world's most enduring civilizations. Before you drift off, remember, try not to go to bed with your stomach too full. Give your body the chance to rest lightly. And if you can, put your phone aside a little earlier. Let your mind settle without the glow of the screen. Small choices like these invite calmer sleep and lighter mornings. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me. Sweet dreams, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow night, here at Sleep Whisper.